In the quiet town of Millfield, a courtroom was filled on a day like no other. A sentencing hearing was underway, a moment where justice was to be served for heinous crimes that had already shaken the community to its core. The air was thick with tension. Lawyers exchanged sharp arguments, their voices cutting through the otherwise solemn chamber. The defendant sat stoically, while family members and onlookers filled the gallery, their faces etched with anger and despair. All eyes were fixed on the judge, who was moments away from delivering a verdict that could either offer closure or ignite outrage. But what no one could have anticipated was that the most crucial voice in that courtroom wasn't seated at the prosecution's table, nor the defense's. It wasn't even the judge's. From the gallery, a figure rose, a girl, barely 13 years old, her face pale but determined. Her words would stop the courtroom in its tracks and leave the judge visibly shaken. What she said was not only unexpected but would go on to change the course of justice itself. What compelled her to stand? What truths had remained hidden, waiting to be unearthed? Imagine a courtroom frozen in silence as a young girl stands up to speak the truth. What happens when courage takes the stand? Stay with us to hear this powerful story. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and click the bell so you never miss an update. Calvin Terry was a man who appeared ordinary to the outside world, an unremarkable figure in the small town of Millfield. Born into a fractured family, he was the eldest of 3 siblings, forced to grow up fast in a household riddled with hardship. His father left when Calvin was just 8, leaving his mother to juggle multiple jobs to keep the family afloat. As a child, Calvin was quiet and withdrawn. Teachers described him as a boy who kept to himself, but his neighbors recalled hearing arguments from the Terry household late into the night. It was clear from an early age that Calvin was exposed to a volatile environment that left him ill-equipped to handle life's challenges. By his late teens, Calvin had dropped out of high school and worked a series of low-paying jobs. He drifted through life without direction, but everything changed when tragedy struck his family. At the age of 29, Calvin's younger sister, Danielle's mother, died in a horrific car accident alongside her husband, leaving 6-year-old Danielle an orphan. Calvin became Danielle's legal guardian, a role he accepted with little hesitation. For the first few years, his actions seemed admirable. Neighbors praised him for stepping up, and Danielle herself clung to him as the only family she had left. But behind closed doors, Calvin's unresolved trauma began to manifest in alarming ways. Court records would later reveal that Calvin's temper was unpredictable, escalating at the slightest provocation. His disciplinary methods grew harsher as time went on, crossing the line into outright abuse. He controlled every aspect of Danielle's life, from her friendships to her education, ensuring she remained isolated and dependent on him. The defense argued that Calvin was a broken man, a product of his environment who lacked the tools to be a proper caregiver. But the prosecution painted a darker picture. Calvin was not simply a man struggling under the weight of responsibility. He was a man who had chosen to exploit his position of power over a vulnerable child. Danielle Thomas was 6 years old when her world was shattered. The loss of her parents in a devastating car accident left her with little more than fragmented memories of a happy, loving home. Suddenly, she found herself in the care of her uncle, a man she barely knew. At first, Danielle's life with Calvin seemed stable. She moved into his small home on the outskirts of Millfield, where she was enrolled in a local elementary school. Teachers described her as polite and eager to learn, though often quiet. Neighbors would see her playing in the yard or walking to the store with Calvin, who always appeared attentive and protective. But as the years went by, cracks began to show. Danielle's once bright personality dimmed, replaced by a cautious, almost timid demeanor. She rarely spoke of her life at home, and when she did, her words were carefully chosen. "He gets mad sometimes," she once told a teacher, brushing off the comment with a nervous laugh. Despite the challenges she faced, Danielle excelled academically. Her teachers marveled at her intelligence and determination, often describing her as a gifted student. But they also noticed the signs: unexplained bruises, frequent absences, and a reluctance to participate in activities that required parental involvement. Danielle's resilience was remarkable, but it came at a cost. She learned to navigate Calvin's moods, carefully avoiding anything that might trigger his anger. Her life became a delicate balancing act, one where survival depended on silence. Judge Davis Carrington was a man defined by his principles. Known throughout Millfield for his unwavering commitment to justice, he had spent over 2 decades on the bench, presiding over cases that tested the limits of human decency. His reputation for fairness was matched only by his sharp intellect and ability to remain composed under pressure. Carrington's path to the judiciary was shaped by his own modest beginnings. Raised in a working-class family, he understood the struggles of those who came before him in his courtroom. His parents instilled in him a deep respect for the law and a belief in its power to protect the vulnerable. As a judge, Carrington was meticulous, often spending hours reviewing evidence and considering every angle of a case. He believed that the courtroom was not just a place for punishment, but a place for truth. And yet even he had moments where the weight of his role felt overwhelming. The Terry case was one such moment. As he prepared to deliver a sentence, Carrington felt the gravity of his decision more acutely than usual. The evidence was clear, the arguments compelling, but something about the case left him uneasy. It wasn't the defense's plea for leniency or the prosecution's demand for justice. It was the silence of the victim, Danielle Thomas, who had remained largely absent from the proceedings. Carrington had seen many cases involving child abuse, each one leaving a mark on him. But as he looked out at the gallery, his gaze briefly landing on the quiet figure of Danielle, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than had been revealed. It was a late afternoon in Millfield, and the neighborhood was quiet. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden hue over the modest homes that lined the streets. Inside one of those homes, however, a very different scene was unfolding, one that would soon shatter the facade of tranquility and lead to a series of events that no one in the community could have anticipated. Calvin Terry had been growing increasingly agitated throughout the day. Danielle, his 13-year-old niece, had accidentally spilled a glass of water on the dining table while cleaning up. For most guardians, it would have been a minor incident, easily forgiven and forgotten. But for Calvin, it was a trigger. His temper, always volatile, erupted with frightening intensity. Danielle, accustomed to his outbursts, tried to apologize and clean up the mess quickly, but Calvin's rage was unrelenting. He grabbed her by the arm, his grip so tight it left marks, and began yelling at her. His voice carried through the thin walls of the house, loud enough for the neighbors to hear. Next door, an elderly woman named Margaret Wells was tending to her garden. She paused when she heard Calvin's shouting. Margaret had lived in the neighborhood for decades and had always considered herself someone who minded her own business. But over the years, she had noticed troubling patterns at the Terry household. Danielle's quiet demeanor, her reluctance to interact with other children, and the frequent shouting that seemed to emanate from the home. That day, Margaret felt something was different. The yelling was louder than usual, and she could hear Danielle's muffled cries. Concerned, she moved closer to her window, straining to listen. What she heard next made her blood run cold. "Do you think anyone cares about you?" Calvin bellowed. "You're useless!" Margaret's instincts kicked in. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her voice trembling as she explained the situation to the operator. "I'm not sure what's happening, but I think a child is in danger," she said. "Please send someone quickly." Within minutes, the sound of sirens pierced the evening air. A patrol car pulled up to the Terry residence, and 2 officers stepped out, their expressions serious. Margaret watched anxiously from her window, praying that she had done the right thing. Inside the house, Calvin froze when he heard the knock on the door. His grip on Danielle's arm loosened, and for a brief moment she dared to hope that the worst was over. The knocking grew louder, followed by a firm voice. "Police! Open the door!" Calvin hesitated, but eventually opened the door, his expression a mix of anger and apprehension. The officers introduced themselves and explained that they were responding to a report of a domestic disturbance. Danielle stood behind Calvin, her face pale and her eyes downcast. One of the officers noticed the red marks on her arm and gently asked her to step forward. "Are you okay?" he asked, his tone kind but concerned. Danielle hesitated, her eyes darting toward Calvin, who glared at her menacingly. Sensing her fear, the officer assured her, "You're safe now. You can talk to us." Slowly, Danielle nodded and whispered, "I'm fine." But her trembling hands and tear-streaked face told a different story. The officers decided to separate Calvin and Danielle to get a clearer picture of the situation. While one officer spoke to Calvin in the living room, the other took Danielle outside to ask her questions privately. Away from her uncle's intimidating presence, Danielle couldn't open up. Instead, she burst into tears. Inside, the other officer questioned Calvin, whose answers were evasive and defensive. When asked about the marks on Danielle's arm, Calvin claimed she was clumsy and had probably hurt herself. But his story began to unravel as Danielle's testimony outside provided a starkly different account. After a brief consultation, the officers made their decision. They returned to the living room and informed Calvin that he was under arrest for suspected child abuse. Calvin protested loudly, insisting that the officers were making a mistake, but they remained firm. As they placed him in handcuffs, one officer read him his rights while the other escorted him to the patrol car. Margaret watched from her window as Calvin was led away. She felt a mix of relief and sadness, knowing that Danielle's ordeal had finally come to light, but regretting that she hadn't acted sooner. The police arranged for Danielle to be taken to a safe location while the investigation began. Social services were called in, and medical professionals documented her injuries. Her initial reluctance to speak gave way to a flood of stories as she realized she was finally in a place where she could be heard and believed. The courtroom was a portrait of tension. Calvin sat stoically, his face betraying no emotion while the attorneys exchanged final arguments. The prosecution's voice carried the weight of Danielle's suffering, their words painting a vivid picture of her pain. The defense countered with pleas for understanding, emphasizing Calvin's troubled past. Meanwhile, Danielle sat quietly in the gallery, her hands folded in her lap. To the casual observer, she was just another face in the crowd, a child lost in the shuffle of legal proceedings. But those who looked closer might have noticed the way her gaze occasionally flickered toward the judge, as though she were mustering the courage to do something no one expected. And then, just as the judge prepared to speak, something happened that would change the course of the hearing, and the lives of everyone in that room forever. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that feels alive with tension. Judge Davis Carrington sat poised, his gavel resting nearby, ready to deliver a sentence that had been meticulously prepared. He adjusted his glasses and glanced briefly at the papers in front of him. This court has carefully reviewed the evidence. His deep, measured voice began, carrying an air of finality that gripped everyone in the room. The gallery sat in stillness, their eyes fixed on the judge, awaiting the words that would close this painful chapter. Even Calvin Terry, seated at the defense table, betrayed a hint of nervousness, his normally impassive face slightly taut. Just as Carrington took a breath to continue, the sound of a chair scraping across the floor cut through the heavy quiet. Heads turned in unison toward the source, emotions so synchronized it was as if the room itself had been choreographed. Standing in the back was a young girl, her frame dwarfed by the towering adults around her. It was Danielle Thomas. She raised her hand hesitantly, her voice soft but audible. "Your Honor, sir, I need to say something." The room froze. A moment passed that felt like an eternity. All eyes were now on Danielle, whose small figure seemed to carry a weight far beyond her years. The attorneys exchanged puzzled glances, unsure of how to respond. Even the judge, known for his composure, hesitated before addressing her. "You wish to speak?" Judge Carrington asked, his tone cautious but firm. Danielle nodded. "Yes, sir, Your Honor." A ripple of whispers broke out across the gallery, the murmurs growing louder as people struggled to grasp what was happening. Calvin shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting toward Danielle, then quickly away. Judge Carrington raised his hand to silence the murmurs. "Approach the stand," he said, his voice now carrying a note of curiosity and concern. Danielle hesitated, her small hands gripping the edges of her seat, before slowly beginning to make her way to the front of the courtroom. Each step she took echoed loudly in the stillness, amplifying the gravity of the moment. Danielle reached the stand, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the microphone. She glanced at the judge, then at the rows of spectators behind her, her wide eyes scanning the room. The weight of the moment was palpable, but her resolve was clear. She took a deep breath, her voice trembling slightly as she began. "I've listened to everyone talk about him, about Calvin, about how hard his life has been, but no one has talked about mine." The courtroom remained deathly silent. Every word she spoke seemed to hang in the air, heavy with unspoken truths. "For years I thought it was my fault," she continued. "When he hurt me, I thought I deserved it. When he called me names, I believed him. He made me feel like I didn't deserve love or happiness." Her voice cracked, and a collective intake of breath rippled through the gallery. Tears welled in the eyes of several spectators, their gazes fixed on the brave girl standing before them. "But I know now that I do deserve those things," Danielle said, her voice growing stronger. "No one deserves to feel the way he made me feel." The emotional impact of her words was undeniable. Members of the jury shifted in their seats, their faces a mixture of shock and sorrow. The prosecutor leaned forward, their pen hovering over their notes, while the defense attorney sat rigidly, visibly uncomfortable. Then came the revelation that stunned the courtroom. Danielle hesitated, her voice faltering for the first time. "There's something else I need to say," she murmured. "Even after the investigation started, even after people said they were watching him." He didn't stop. A collective gasp filled the room, followed by a flurry of hushed whispers. The judge struck his gavel sharply. "Order!" he commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. Danielle continued, her voice steady despite the tears now streaming down her face. I didn't know how to tell anyone. I was scared. I thought no one would believe me. But I can't stay quiet anymore. He didn't stop hurting me. Judge Carrington's usually composed demeanor faltered for a brief moment. His eyes narrowed as he leaned forward, studying Danielle intently. "Are you saying that the abuse continued after the investigation began?" he asked, his voice slow and deliberate. Danielle nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." The weight of her words settled over the courtroom like a heavy fog. Carrington leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He adjusted his glasses, his gaze momentarily drifting to the attorneys. The defense lawyer looked pale, beads of sweat forming on his forehead, while the prosecutor's face was etched with a mix of fury and determination. The judge took a deep breath, his hands gripping the edges of his bench. "This testimony is both unexpected and deeply troubling. The court will take a recess to verify these claims and determine the appropriate course of action." With a sharp strike of his gavel, the judge adjourned the session for a brief recess. The courtroom erupted into a flurry of activity as spectators began to murmur, reporters scrambled to take notes, and attorneys whispered urgently among themselves. As the courtroom emptied, Danielle remained seated at the witness stand, her hands folded in her lap. She looked tired, but there was a quiet strength in her eyes. Reporters outside the courtroom clamored for statements, their cameras flashing as people streamed out. Judge Carrington, still seated at his bench, watched Danielle for a moment before standing and leaving the room. It was clear to everyone present that this case had just taken a significant turn, one that would have repercussions far beyond the walls of the courtroom. After a brief recess, the courtroom reconvened. The atmosphere was charged with a mix of tension and anticipation. Judge Davis Carrington, now seated at the bench, called the court to order. His expression was serious, his voice calm but firm. "Miss Thomas," he began, addressing Danielle, who had returned to the stand. "You understand the gravity of what you've shared with this court. I want to allow you to speak further. If there's anything else you wish to say, you may do so now." Danielle nodded, her hands gripping the edges of the stand. The weight of the moment was visible on her face, but her resolve was unshaken. She glanced briefly at the gallery, where members of the community sat, their eyes fixed on her. "There's more," she began softly, her voice steady but quiet. "When the investigation started, I thought it would stop. I thought someone would come and make it all go away. But he didn't stop." The room grew eerily still as her words hung in the air. Even the sound of pens scratching against paper ceased. Danielle hesitated for a moment, then continued. "He told me no one would believe me, that everyone would think I was lying, so I stayed quiet. I didn't know what else to do, but even when people came to the house, he acted like nothing was wrong, and when they left, it just got worse." Her voice trembled slightly, but she pushed on. "He said it was my fault the neighbors were looking at him, that I brought it on myself, and every time I believed him, but I can't keep this inside anymore." Danielle's words were raw, her emotions laid bare for the entire courtroom to see. The courage it took to stand before a room full of strangers and share the darkest moments of her life was evident in every word she spoke. Danielle drew a shaky breath as she started to open up another incident. "It happened on a Saturday," she began softly, her voice almost a whisper. The gallery leaned in, straining to hear. "I was 9 years old." The memory surged forward as if it had happened yesterday. "It was supposed to be a good day," Danielle continued, her eyes fixed on the floor. "I had finished all my chores early because I was excited. Calvin said that if I did well, he would take me to the park." She smiled faintly at the memory of her excitement, but the smile faded quickly. "I cleaned the kitchen and the living room, just like he told me to," she said. "But when he came home, he wasn't happy. He looked angry." Danielle paused for a moment as if reliving the tension in the air that day. As the story unfolds, think about this. How would you react in her position? Could you find the courage to speak out? Share your thoughts below. And if this story is inspiring you, give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more like this. He walked in and saw a glass of water on the table that I had forgotten to put away. It wasn't a big deal, but to him it was. Her voice trembled as she continued. "He yelled at me. I don't even remember what he said exactly, but his face was red and his eyes were wild. I told him I was sorry, but it didn't matter. He grabbed the glass and threw it at the wall." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. The jurors exchanged glances, their faces grim as they absorbed the scene she was painting. Danielle's voice dropped, but it was steady. "Then he grabbed my arm," she said, holding up her small wrist, as if the marks were still there. "He squeezed so hard I thought he was going to break it. I started crying, but he didn't let go." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't stop. "He pushed me against the wall," she said. "I hit my head. It hurt, but I didn't say anything. I knew that would only make it worse. The courtroom remained deathly silent. Even Calvin, seated at the defense table, refused to meet anyone's eyes. Danielle pressed on, her words now flowing without hesitation. He told me that I was useless, that I would never amount to anything, that I deserved everything bad that happened to me. She paused, her voice barely audible, and for a long time I believed him. The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved, no one spoke. Even the faint sound of breathing seemed to vanish. The weight of Danielle's revelation settled over the room like a heavy fog, leaving everyone frozen in place. In the gallery, a woman wiped tears from her face, while a man beside her shook his head slowly, his expression one of disbelief and sorrow. The jury members sat stiffly, their gazes fixed on Danielle, their faces a mixture of compassion and shock. At the defense table, Calvin Terry stared at the table in front of him, his shoulders hunched and his hands clasped tightly. His expression was unreadable, but there was no mistaking the tension in his posture. The prosecutor, who had remained composed throughout the trial, now appeared visibly moved. They leaned back in their chair, their eyes narrowing as they processed the implications of Danielle's testimony. Judge Carrington, ever the picture of professionalism, sat quietly, his hands clasped together as he absorbed what he had just heard. But even he could not hide the flicker of emotion in his eyes. He took a deep breath, his gaze steady as he addressed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice steady but tinged with gravity, "what we've heard here today is deeply troubling. This court will not ignore the seriousness of these claims. I am ordering a full review of this testimony to ensure that justice is served." The judge's gavel struck sharply, signaling another recess. The room erupted into a flurry of activity. Lawyers gathered in hurried conversations, their voices low but urgent. Officials left the courtroom, their expressions set with determination as they began to gather evidence and verify Danielle's claims. In the hallway outside, reporters scrambled for statements, their cameras clicking rapidly as they tried to capture the gravity of the moment. Members of the gallery filtered out slowly, many of them visibly shaken. Some spoke in hushed tones, expressing their outrage and disbelief, while others walked silently, lost in their thoughts. Inside the courtroom, Danielle remained seated at the stand, her small frame seemingly dwarfed by the weight of what she had just revealed. She looked tired but calm, her gaze focused on the floor as if gathering her thoughts. Judge Carrington watched her quietly from the bench, his mind racing. This case, which had seemed straightforward just hours earlier, was now anything but. The new revelations not only added complexity but also underscored the system's failures that had allowed the abuse to continue. As the recess unfolded, the courthouse became a hive of activity. The prosecution team worked quickly to gather corroborating evidence, their faces etched with determination. They reviewed reports, contacted investigators, and began piecing together a timeline that would support Danielle's testimony. On the other side of the courtroom, the defense team appeared visibly shaken. They huddled together, speaking in hushed tones, their expressions betraying their unease. Calvin sat alone, his hands clenched tightly, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. Outside, the community gathered near the courthouse steps, their voices rising in a mixture of outrage and sorrow. News of Danielle's revelation spread rapidly, drawing more people to the scene. Reporters delivered live updates, their words echoing the shock that had permeated the courtroom. Back inside, Judge Carrington remained at the bench, reviewing documents and considering his next steps. He knew that the court's response to Danielle's testimony would set a precedent, not just for this case, but for all victims who struggled to find their voice. When the court reconvened, the room was noticeably quieter. The earlier buzz of activity had given way to a somber stillness, as if everyone present understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. Judge Carrington addressed the room, his voice steady but resolute. "This court is committed to uncovering the full truth. We will not proceed with sentencing until these new allegations have been thoroughly investigated. Justice demands nothing less." Danielle remained seated, her expression calm, but her eyes glistening with tears. For the first time, she looked relieved. Not because the fight was over, but because she had finally been heard. The courtroom reconvened after a tense and lengthy recess. Judge Davis Carrington returned to the bench, his demeanor reflecting the gravity of the revelations that had come to light. The room was silent, the kind of silence that held the weight of collective anticipation. The prosecutor stood, addressing the judge. "Your Honor, the bravery of this young girl cannot be overstated. What she endured is beyond comprehension, and her courage in speaking about it today speaks volumes about her character." Judge Carrington nodded solemnly, his eyes filled with empathy. "Thank you, Danielle. he said gently. "Your testimony is powerful, and it will not be forgotten." Danielle nodded slowly, her eyes meeting the judge's for a brief moment before she stepped down from the stand. Judge Carrington adjusted his glasses and addressed the courtroom, his tone steady, yet deeply thoughtful. His eyes briefly met Danielle's, acknowledging her courage before he began. "This court has reviewed the information brought forward during today's proceedings," he said, his voice carrying the authority of his years on the bench. "Danielle Thomas, your bravery today has illuminated truths that may otherwise have remained hidden. Speaking out in the face of fear and uncertainty requires immense strength. Your courage has not only changed the course of this trial, but has also reminded this court of the profound impact a single voice can have in the pursuit of justice." The judge paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the courtroom. He turned his attention to Calvin Terry, whose previously calm exterior had now crumbled into visible unease. "The crimes for which you have been convicted represent a profound betrayal of trust," Judge Carrington continued. "Today's testimony has revealed a continued pattern of abuse, even in the face of scrutiny. This court cannot and will not overlook such actions. The law exists to protect the vulnerable and to hold those who harm them accountable." Carrington then delivered the final ruling. Calvin Terry's sentence would be extended significantly, reflecting the new allegations and the severity of his crimes. The judge's words were firm, leaving no room for ambiguity. "As a society, we are judged by how we protect our most vulnerable," he concluded. "Today we have taken a step toward ensuring that justice is not only done, but is seen to be done." The gavel struck, its sound echoing through the courtroom like a declaration of finality. For a moment the room remained still, the significance of the moment sinking in. Then slowly, the gallery began to react. Some nodded in quiet agreement, while others openly wept, overcome with emotion. The case quickly became a national story, sparking headlines across major media outlets. "A child's courage, how one girl exposed years of abuse," read one headline. Another declared, "Justice redefined, a teenager's testimony shakes the courtroom." Television broadcasts replayed clips from the trial, focusing on Danielle's testimony and the judge's powerful statement. Interviews with legal experts praised the court's handling of the case and highlighted the importance of Danielle's bravery. Community members, some of whom had known Calvin or Danielle, shared their thoughts with reporters. "I never imagined she was going through something like that," one neighbor admitted, her voice tinged with regret. "But seeing her stand up like that, she's an inspiration." Online, social media platforms buzzed with discussions about the case. Videos and posts honoring Danielle's courage went viral, with thousands of comments offering support and admiration. Advocacy groups for child abuse victims used the moment to raise awareness, emphasizing the importance of listening to children and taking their concerns seriously. In the days that followed, Danielle's story became a rallying cry for change. Organizations and activists called for reforms in the systems that had failed to protect her, demanding better oversight and accountability. The case of Calvin Terry and Danielle Thomas became more than just a courtroom drama. It became a symbol of resilience, justice, and the power of speaking out. Danielle's decision to break her silence not only changed her life, but also sent a powerful message to victims everywhere. Their voices matter, and justice is possible. For Judge Davis Carrington, the case was a stark reminder of the responsibilities that come with his role. "This trial," he later said in an interview, "is a testament to the courage of those who dare to tell the truth, even when it seems impossible. It is my hope that Danielle's bravery inspires others to do the same, and that it reminds us all of the importance of vigilance in protecting our children." Advocacy groups praised the case as a turning point, highlighting how Danielle's testimony had exposed flaws in the system that allowed the abuse to continue. Policy changes were proposed, including increased support for child welfare services and stricter oversight in abuse investigations. In the end, Danielle's story was not just about the abuse she endured, but about the strength she found within herself to confront it. Her courage in the face of fear and uncertainty resonated far beyond the courtroom, touching the lives of countless others. As one advocacy leader put it, Danielle reminded us that the smallest voice can make the biggest difference. Her story is a call to action for all of us to listen more carefully, to stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves, and to never underestimate the power of truth. The final scene of the documentary shows Danielle walking out of the courthouse, flanked by supporters. Though the journey ahead would not be easy, she carried herself with a newfound confidence, her head held high. The narrator's voice closes with a powerful reflection. "Injustice thrives in silence, but courage has the power to change everything." Danielle Thomas, a 13-year-old girl from a small town, reminded us all that speaking out can illuminate even the darkest corners. She is proof that one voice, no matter how small, can echo across the world. Sometimes the smallest voices echo the loudest, leaving a lasting impact on the world. Danielle's bravery teaches us all an important lesson about speaking up for what's right. What do you think? Could one voice change the world? Share your thoughts in the comments, like this video, and subscribe to stay connected for more powerful stories. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.